My younger sister sent a message in our family group chat on a Tuesday night. It said, "Just so you know, Megan isn't invited to Grandma's birthday dinner. She makes everything about herself, and honestly, the rest of us would have a better time without her." My mom replied with a heart emoji. My dad sent a thumbs up. I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I typed, "Understood," and put it face down on my kitchen counter. I didn't cry. I made tea. I went to bed. That was 8 months before my sister and her husband walked into my office building looking for someone to approve their commercial loan application. I should back up. I grew up in Mississauga, Ontario, the oldest of 2 girls. My sister Paige is 4 years younger than me, and she has always been the one my parents pointed to when they wanted to feel proud out loud. When Paige got a B in math, my mom framed the test. When I got an A, she asked why it wasn't an A+. I'm not bitter about that anymore, or at least I've done enough therapy to know that bitterness isn't the word for what I feel. It's more like a very specific fatigue, the kind that comes from spending 32 years being quietly confused about why you keep trying. I work in commercial real estate finance. I'm a senior credit analyst at a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto. We assess risk, structure deals, approve or deny financing for commercial properties and development projects across Ontario. It's not glamorous. Most people's eyes glaze over when I explain what I do. My mom once told a neighbor that I work in an office doing numbers, which is technically accurate. The way saying Niagara Falls is, some water is technically accurate. I got into the field because I was good at it. I did my undergrad at McMaster, went straight into a graduate certificate in financial analysis at Toronto Metropolitan University. I still forget. And then spent 6 years grinding my way up. I rent a condo in Liberty Village. I drive a used Subaru. I cook most of my own meals. My life is not dramatic. That has always seemed to be the problem as far as my family is concerned. Paige, on the other hand, has always lived in a way that required an audience. She married her husband Callum 3 years ago. Callum is the kind of person who has a lot of opinions about things he's never researched. He did some renovation contracting for a while, then decided he wanted to open a restaurant, then pivoted to wanting to buy a commercial property and lease it to small businesses, which is how he ended up needing a commercial loan. The restaurant idea had already cost them about $40,000 in planning and permits before they abandoned it. I know this because Paige told me in the context of asking whether I could help them get a good rate somewhere. I told her I didn't handle client intake, which was true, and that she should go through the normal application channels at any institution, which was also true. She told our mom I had refused to help, which was a version of events that required several facts to be missing. My relationship with Paige has been complicated for most of our adult lives, but it got notably worse after she married Callum. He has a way of speaking that makes you feel like you're being condescended to even when he's asking for directions. At my cousin's wedding 2 summers ago, he spent 20 minutes explaining to me how the finance industry works. I nodded a lot. I said, in what I hope were convincing intervals. When he finished, I said, "That's really interesting," and he looked satisfied, which was the outcome I had been managing toward. Paige has always followed his lead. It started slowly and then all at once, the way most erosion does. First, she stopped disagreeing with him in public. Then she started repeating his opinions as her own. Then she started applying his dread on people to our whole family, which meant that I, practical, non-dramatic, doesn't need to be the center of everything Megan, became the family problem. Too independent, too focused on work, makes everything about herself. That last one still makes me laugh a little. In a dark way, I make everything about myself. I, who had spent the previous Christmas at my parents' house in Brampton cooking the entire dinner while Paige and Callum sat in the living room watching a Netflix documentary about Formula One. The group chat message about Grandma's birthday dinner was in October. The dinner itself was a Saturday night in November. I spent that Saturday driving to visit a friend in Hamilton instead. We ate Thai food and watched a movie, and I didn't think about the dinner much. When my mom called Sunday morning and asked why I hadn't reached out to explain my absence, I reminded her I hadn't been invited. There was a pause. Then she said, "Well, Paige says you knew the time and place." I told her I'd get back to her. I didn't. I want to be clear about something because I think people expect this kind of story to involve a plan. They expect that I knew something was coming, that I was strategic, that I had been quietly waiting for the moment the tables would turn. That's not what happened. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just living my life doing my job and trying to have a lower blood pressure than my job naturally encourages. What happened in February was not something I engineered. It arrived on its own, the way most things that matter actually do. It was a Wednesday. I was at my desk reviewing a package for a mixed-use development in Etobicoke when my colleague knocked on the glass partition of my office. He said there was a couple downstairs who had come in without an appointment asking about a commercial mortgage application. They hadn't come through the normal intake process. They'd apparently just walked into the building and asked at the front desk if there was someone who could talk to them about a loan. The front desk had, somewhat charitably, sent them up to our floor. My colleague was asking me because I was the senior analyst on that day and technically the most appropriate person to do a very short preliminary conversation before directing them to proper channels. I said sure and followed him out. They were standing near the reception area by the elevator bank. Paige had her back to me. She was wearing a white wool coat I hadn't seen before, and her hair was different, longer. Callum was the one facing my direction, and he was looking down at his phone. I stopped walking. My colleague kept going for 2 steps before he realized I wasn't beside him anymore. He turned around and gave me a questioning look. I took a breath. I genuinely considered just going back to my office and sending someone else. There was nothing requiring me to do this personally. But I thought about the birthday dinner. I thought about the thumbs up emoji from my dad. And I thought, not vindictively, I want to be honest about this. I thought, no, I'm going to do my job. I walked to the reception desk. I can take this, I said to my colleague, and he nodded and went back toward the workstations. I came around the side of the reception desk, and Callum looked up from his phone. He looked at me with the blank, polite expression of someone who doesn't recognize a face but is trying to place it. Then I watched the recognition land. It moved across his face in stages, like a slow buffering scream. Paige turned around. Her expression was not what I would call composed. "Megan," she said. It wasn't a greeting exactly. It was more the way you say someone's name when you are trying to buy time to process something. "Hi," I said. "I understand you're interested in commercial financing." Callum recovered faster. He actually smiled, that particular smile he has that I've always found slightly too wide. "We didn't know you worked here," he said. He said it casually, like we had run into each other at a farmer's market. "I've been here 4 years," I said. "Why don't we sit down?" There's a small meeting room just off reception that we use for preliminary client conversations. Nothing formal, just a table and 4 chairs and a window that looks out over Front Street. I led them in and closed the door and sat across from them and opened my laptop. I want to pause here and say something about professionalism because I think it matters. I have a job. That job involves assessing applications based on specific criteria: financial history, credit profile, debt service coverage ratios, collateral, business plans. These are not subjective categories. They are not categories that change based on whether I have personal feelings about the applicant. My job was to do a preliminary intake conversation and then either move their file forward or explain why I couldn't. That's all. I asked them to walk me through what they were looking for. Callum did most of the talking. They wanted to purchase a commercial property in Oakville. A small strip plaza, older building, 4 units, 1 anchor tenant already in place. The asking price was $1.4 million. They had approximately $180,000 in savings they were proposing to use as a down payment. I asked about their current financial situation, income, existing debt, credit history. Callum said they had good credit and that he'd been doing contracting work for years, so he had proof of income. He said it in the way people say things when they haven't actually pulled the credit report recently. I asked whether they had been through a pre-qualification process with any lender. He said they had talked to someone at their bank who had been not very helpful. I asked whether that conversation had resulted in any written assessment. He said it was just a chat. I typed notes. I kept my face the way I keep my face when I'm working, which is to say neutral and attentive. Then I asked about existing liabilities, whether they had any outstanding lines of credit, personal loans, or previous business financing that hadn't been resolved. There was a pause. Paige looked at Callum. Callum looked at the table for a moment. He mentioned the restaurant planning costs. He mentioned that they had a home equity line of credit they'd drawn on in the last 18 months. He mentioned, and this came out in that particular tone people use when they're hoping you won't follow up, that there had been a small claim situation the previous year that had since been resolved. I asked what the situation had involved. He said it was a contractor dispute. He said it had been settled. He said it wasn't relevant. I said gently but clearly that anything that had appeared on a credit record in the last 7 years would be visible to any lender reviewing their application, and it was better to walk me through it now than to have it surface during underwriting. Another pause. The restaurant concept, the one they had spent $40,000 on before abandoning, had apparently not gone cleanly. There was a supplier who hadn't been paid. There was a lease deposit on a commercial kitchen space in Mississauga that they had forfeited. The small claim situation involved a former business partner who had sued Callum for a breach of a verbal agreement and had been awarded $8,200. I typed all of this. I did not change my expression. I asked him for the address of their current residence so I could confirm the property type for the HELOC disclosure. Paige gave me their address. It was a house in a suburb west of Brampton. I hadn't known they'd moved. I had been in that area before. I have a decent sense of property values. I asked, as a standard intake question, approximately how much of the HELOC had been drawn. Callum said around 60,000. I kept typing. I need to explain here how commercial mortgage qualification actually works in Canada, because I think the specific details matter. Under standard lending guidelines, whether you're at a Schedule A bank or a private lender, a commercial mortgage application for a $1.4 million property requires, at minimum, a 25% down payment for a conventional loan, which would be $350,000. They had $180,000. That gap alone would require them to either bring in a co-borrower, seek CMHC-insured financing for commercial property, which has its own significant eligibility restrictions, or find a private lender willing to take a higher LTV at a substantially higher interest rate, typically 2 to 4 points above prime, with lender fees on top. Beyond the down payment gap, the application would face significant challenges based on what Callum had described. The HELOC draws would factor into their total debt service. The small claims judgment, even settled, would appear on Callum's credit bureau. Income documentation for self-employed applicants in contracting requires a 2-year average of tax returns. If those years had included the restaurant planning losses, the net income picture would be complicated. Not later, over the phone, not later, when me making a judgment call. It was arithmetic. When I finished my intake notes, I turned my laptop slightly so they could see the summary section, which I do with all preliminary applicants because I think people deserve to understand clearly where they stand. I walked them through it: the down payment gap, the HELOC exposure, the credit flag from the judgment, the income documentation requirements for self-employed applicants. I told them that this didn't mean commercial financing was impossible, but that they would need to either bring significantly more capital to the table or find a private lender and factor in the higher cost of that kind of financing. I told them what the realistic monthly carrying cost would look like at different rate scenarios. I told them what a lender would need to see from them before a file could move forward. Callum was quiet for most of this. Paige was looking at the table. At the end, Callum asked if there was any way I could, and he paused here, searching for the phrasing, use my position to help move things along. He said it with a kind of careful casualness, the way people say things they're hoping will land without them having to say them plainly. I looked at him for a moment. I'm not a decision maker on applications, I said. I'm an analyst. I assess the file and provide a recommendation. What I've walked you through today is exactly what any analyst at any institution would tell you. The numbers are the numbers. He nodded slowly. He said he understood. Paige hadn't said much for the last 20 minutes. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had walked into a building expecting one thing and found something else entirely, and was still working out what that meant. As we were wrapping up, she said my name again. She said, Megan, we didn't know you were here. I know, I said. I'm sorry, she said. About the dinner, about all of it. I want to be honest about what happened in my chest when she said that. There was something there. Of course there was. She's my sister. 28 years of shared bedrooms and inside jokes, and the specific texture of growing up in the same house that doesn't disappear because someone sent a bad text in a group chat. The feeling was real. But I also knew in the specific and hard-won way that you know things after enough time, that an apology in a moment of personal difficulty is different from an apology that arrives without context. I couldn't separate the two in that room. I wasn't sure she could either. I appreciate that, I said. And I meant it. I just meant it quietly. I walked them back out to the elevator. I shook Callum's hand, because I'm a professional and that is what you do, and I told him I'd send a written summary of our conversation and the documentation requirements to the email address they'd provided, which is standard process. The elevator doors closed. I went back to my office. I closed the door. I sat down. I didn't do anything dramatic. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat there for maybe 3 minutes just letting the strange compressed feeling in my ribs settle, and then I went back to the Etobicoke file because it wasn't going to review itself. The summary email I sent them that afternoon was thorough and professional and contained no personal commentary whatsoever. It laid out exactly what I told them, with links to CMHC's commercial financing guidelines and a list of documents they would need to gather before approaching any lender. I CC'd my manager, because I always CC my manager on preliminary intake summaries, which is standard practice and which also, yes, created a clean paper trail in the event that anyone later had questions about my handling of the file. My manager asked me the next morning if I knew the applicants personally. I told her they were family. She nodded slowly. She asked if I wanted to recuse myself from any future file involvement. I said yes. She said good, and that was that. I called my mom 2 days later, not because she'd called me, she hadn't. I called her because I'd been thinking about the look on Paige's face in that meeting room, and I decided I wanted to say something before the version of the story that would eventually reach my parents was fully assembled by someone else. I told my mom where I worked. I told her my title. I explained in plain terms what my job involved. There was a long silence on the phone. She said, I didn't know you were that senior. I said, Mom, you could have asked. Another silence. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't realized. She said she thought I was just. She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what the end of it was. She thought I was just doing something quiet and invisible. The same thing I had always been doing, not worth the space it would take to look at directly. I told her I loved her. I told her I needed some time. She said she understood. What happened with Paige and Callum's application is not something I was involved in. I recused myself cleanly and another analyst handled the file. I genuinely do not know what their outcome was, and I made no attempt to find out, not to help, and not to hurt. It wasn't my file anymore. What I can tell you is that I didn't feel triumphant after that Wednesday. I want to set that record straight, because I know how these stories are supposed to feel at the end. They're supposed to be a moment where you walk back into your office and feel the warm glow of justice and think, I won. That's not what it was. What it was clarifying. I had spent most of my adult life being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me first. And then one Wednesday in February, in a meeting room on Front Street, they walked through the door. They saw the laptop and the intake notes and the business card on the table with my name and my title on it. They saw the office. They saw the 4 years and the 6 years before that and the degree before that. They saw me doing the thing I do. That's not triumph. That's just there. I'm here. I have been here the whole time. A few weeks after that, I signed the papers on a piece of property I'd been watching for 2 years. A small commercial unit in Guelph that I'm leasing to an independent bookshop. The financing process was detailed and occasionally tedious, and I understood every single part of it because it's my job, and I'm good at my job. I didn't tell my family about it right away. I just drove out there on a Saturday morning and stood outside the unit and watched the bookshop owner hang her sign in the window. And then I went and got coffee at a place down the street and sat for a while. The family group chat still exists. I'm still in it. People send birthday messages and photos of the dog and links to things. Sometimes I reply, sometimes I don't. Paige sent me a message in March, just me, not the group, asking if I wanted to have lunch sometime. I said maybe later in the spring when things settle down. I haven't decided yet. I'm thinking about it. But I'm thinking about it from a place that feels, for the first time in a long time, like solid ground. I keep thinking about the moment Paige said my name in that meeting room. Not the way she used to say it when we were kids, sharing a bedroom, or the way she'd say it across a holiday dinner table. She said it the way you say something when the ground has just shifted under you and you're not sure yet how far you've fallen. There's a version of this story where I feel vindicated, where I walk back to my desk and think finally, but that's not what happened, and I think it's worth being honest about why. What I've come to understand, not from that one Wednesday, but from everything that led up to it, is that the outcomes in our lives have a way of reflecting the choices that built them. Not in a neat cinematic way, not overnight, but over time, quietly and without announcement, the things we invest in start to show. I spent years investing in my work, in my competence, in showing up and understanding the details and not cutting corners even when no one was watching. Paige and Callum had spent those same years looking for shortcuts, leaning on relationships they hadn't ended, expecting doors to open because they felt they deserved it. That Wednesday in February was just the moment those two different trajectories happened to cross in the same room. I don't think people are punished for being careless. I think they just eventually arrive at the destination their choices have been building toward all along. And the same is true in the other direction. What saved me, if that's even the right word, wasn't luck and it wasn't some dramatic stand I took. It was smaller than that. It was the decision, made over and over again across ordinary Tuesday mornings, to do the work anyway, to understand what I was doing deeply enough that I couldn't be dismissed, to stay honest in my assessments even when it would have been easier or kinder in the short term to soften the numbers. That's not a personality trait you're born with. It's something you build, slowly, by choosing it when it cost you something. The hardest part wasn't the meeting itself. The hardest part was the years before it, being invisible to the people who should have seen me, and deciding that their blindness wasn't a reason to stop building something worth seeing. That takes a particular kind of stubbornness, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience. I think about my colleague who knocked on my office partition that Wednesday and asked if I could take a preliminary meeting. He didn't know what was waiting downstairs. I didn't either. And yet, everything I'd done for the previous decade meant that when I walked into that room, I was exactly prepared for it. I knew what the numbers meant. I knew how to hold the conversation without flinching. I knew in a way that had nothing to do with ego, that I was standing on solid ground. Paige asked if we could have lunch sometime. I haven't said yes yet, but I'm thinking about it, not from a place of wanting to win anything, or prove anything, or collect some acknowledgement I've been owed. I'm thinking about it from a place of, she's my sister, and people can grow, and I have enough solid ground under my feet now that I don't need the conversation to go any particular way. That's what I want to hold on to. Not the moment they walked through the door, but the work that made me ready when they did.